Welcome to this journey through one of the most haunting cases of familial imprisonment in American history. Tell us where you're watching from now, because this story will disturb you in a way few other accounts can. Not through violence, but through the suffocating weight of decades lost, of a life confined to shadows while the world moved on below. We're about to delve into a mystery that lay hidden in plain sight for 3 decades, where a young woman's existence was erased by those who should have protected her, leaving a legacy so disturbing that it forces us to question how many other forgotten souls might be trapped in the attics and basements of ordinary-looking homes. It was the year 1963. President Kennedy would be assassinated in November, forever altering the American psyche. The civil rights movement was reaching its crescendo, and the nation was transforming at a pace that left many communities struggling to keep up. But in a modest two-story house on a tree-lined street in Buffalo, New York, time was about to stop completely for one young woman. While the world outside spun forward into the space age and social revolution, she would remain frozen, a prisoner in her own home, her voice unheard, her face unseen. Her name was Blanche Monnier, though that's not quite right. That was the famous French case from the 19th century. No, this woman's name was Edith Eckert, and her story is perhaps even more chilling because it happened not in some distant Victorian era, but in modern America, in a neighborhood where children played on sidewalks and families barbecued in backyards, where everyone knew everyone else's business, or thought they did. The house itself was unremarkable. A 2-story colonial structure painted a pale yellow, with white shutters that needed a fresh coat, and a front porch where a rocking chair sat perpetually still. The lawn was maintained but not manicured, the kind of working-class respectability that characterized much of Buffalo's South Side in the 1960s. Maple trees lined Delaware Avenue, their branches forming a canopy that filtered the harsh upstate New York sunlight into dappled patterns on the pavement below. The Eckert family had lived there since 1951. Wilhelm Eckert, known to neighbors as Will, was a machinist at the Bethlehem steel plant, one of thousands who punched the clock and brought home steady paychecks that kept Buffalo's economy humming. His wife, Clothilda, was a German immigrant who never quite lost her accent, a stern woman whose face seemed carved from the same granite that formed the foundations of the city's churches. They had 4 children, 3 sons and 1 daughter. The daughter was Edith. Neighbors remembered her as a quiet girl, thin and pale, with dark eyes that seemed too large for her face. She attended public school 72, where teachers noted she was a competent student, neither brilliant nor struggling, the kind of child who occupied the vast middle ground of classroom anonymity. She had few friends. At recess, while other girls jumped rope or played jacks, Edith often stood alone near the fence, watching the clouds drift overhead with an expression that one teacher later described as elsewhere. But she wasn't unhappy, or so it seemed. She smiled when spoken to. She completed her assignments. She went home each day to the yellow house on Delaware Avenue, disappearing through the front door into the domestic darkness that all children of that era knew, a world of mothers and kitchens and rules that outsiders never questioned. Something changed in 1963. Edith was 21 years old then, no longer a child, but a young woman on the cusp of whatever life might offer. She had graduated from high school 3 years earlier, worked briefly as a clerk at the Woolworths downtown, but had quit, or been made to quit, after only 6 months. Her mother had explained to neighbors that Edith wasn't right for that kind of work, that she was needed at home, that she had nervous troubles. Nervous troubles. That phrase was a catch-all in that era, a socially acceptable explanation for everything from depression to schizophrenia, from social anxiety to genuine psychotic breaks. It was a label that required no proof, invited no questions, and closed all doors to outside intervention. In the spring of that year, Edith simply stopped appearing. The disappearance was gradual enough that no one really noticed. One day she was at the corner store buying bread for her mother. A week later, she wasn't at Sunday Mass. A month after that, when Mrs. Kowalski from next door asked about her, Clothilde explained that Edith had gone to stay with relatives in Rochester. Then the story changed. She was in a sanatorium upstate, getting treatment for her nervous condition. Then she'd gone to work for a family in Pennsylvania as a housekeeper. The stories never quite aligned, but in an era before social media, before the constant documentation of every life moment, before the expectation that young people would be seen and accounted for, a quiet young woman could simply fade from view without triggering alarm bells. Except she hadn't gone anywhere at all. She was still in the house on Delaware Avenue, still under the same roof as her parents and brothers, still breathing the same air, hearing the same sounds of daily life, doors opening and closing, water running through pipes, the murmur of the television downstairs, the clatter of dishes at dinner time, but she was no longer part of that life. She was upstairs, in the attic, behind a door that had been fitted with a lock on the outside. The attic of the Eckert house was not the finished kind that some families converted into extra bedrooms or playrooms. It was a true attic. The skeletal space beneath the pitched roof, where exposed rafters cast angular shadows and insulation hung in yellow-pink bats between the joists. There was one small window at the gable end, a circular vent covered with wire mesh that let in minimal light and even less air. The ceiling was too low for comfortable standing in most places. Only at the center, directly under the roof's peak, could a person of average height stand upright. The floorboards were rough and unfinished, studded with nail heads that caught at bare feet. In summer, the attic became an oven, the black asphalt shingles absorbing the sun's heat until the air inside was thick and suffocating. In winter, it was barely warmer than the frozen world outside, the thin walls and poor insulation offering little protection from Buffalo's legendary cold. This was where Edith lived, not lived existed, survived, endured. The space that became her world measured approximately 12 feet by 20 feet, though much of it was unusable due to the sloping ceiling. Her parents had placed a narrow bed along one wall, a metal, framed thing with a thin mattress that had probably been old when they put it there. There was a chamber pot that would be emptied irregularly, sometimes daily, sometimes not for days, depending on Clothilde's mood or busy schedule. A single bare bulb hung from the ceiling on a wire, controlled by a switch downstairs that her mother operated according to her own inscrutable schedule. There were no books, no radio, no television, no calendar, no clock. Time became an abstraction measured only by the light that filtered through the mesh, covered vent bright for day, dark for night, with no way to distinguish Tuesday from Saturday, March from October, except by the intensity of heat or cold. The door was solid wood, reinforced. The lock was industrial, the kind used in factories and warehouses. Her father had installed it himself, taking care to ensure it would withstand any amount of force applied from the inside. The key stayed on a chain around Clothilde's neck, always. Even when she slept, the cold metal pressed against her sternum, a constant reminder of her control. Why? That question would echo through the decades that followed. Why would parents do this to their own child? What transgression could possibly justify such punishment? What illness could require such containment? The answers, when they eventually came, were as disturbing as the imprisonment itself. According to Clothilda's later testimony, given decades afterward when the truth could no longer be contained, Edith had become difficult. She had expressed interest in a young man from the neighborhood, a Puerto Rican boy named Raphael, who worked at the same Woolworths where she'd been employed. They had been seen talking, laughing. He had walked her home once. For Clothilda, this was unacceptable. Interracial relationships were anathema to her rigid world view, a violation of the natural order as she understood it. When she forbade Edith from seeing Raphael, Edith had protested. She had raised her voice. She had said that she was an adult, that she could make her own choices. This defiance, this assertion of autonomy, could not be tolerated. The first night in the attic, Edith had screamed. She had pounded on the door until her fists were bruised and swollen. She had begged, cried, pleaded. Her brothers heard it all from their rooms below. The middle son, Carl, would later recall lying in his bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to his sister's anguish and doing nothing. Saying nothing, because speaking out against their mother was its own form of suicide. Wilhelm heard it too. He sat in his armchair, newspaper spread before him, though he wasn't reading, while his daughter's desperate pleas filtered down through the ceiling. He said nothing, did nothing. His wife had made a decision, and he would not contradict her. That was not how their marriage worked. That was not how German families maintained order. After 3 days, the screaming stopped. After a week, the pounding stopped. After 2 weeks, the begging stopped. Edith had learned the futility of resistance. The first year was probably the worst, though there's no way to quantify such suffering. Every day was a fresh iteration of the same nightmare, waking in the dim light, lying on the narrow bed, staring at the rough wooden rafters above, counting the knots in the wood, tracing the patterns of water stains, watching dust motes drift in the thin beam of light from the vent. Food came irregularly. Sometimes Clothilda brought meals twice a day. A plate of something lukewarm, a cup of water, delivered without comment or eye contact. Sometimes a full day would pass with nothing. The hunger was deliberate, a form of control, a reminder that Edith's very survival depended on her mother's mercy. She lost weight rapidly. The already thin girl became skeletal, her cheekbones sharp beneath skin that grew translucent from lack of sunlight. Her hair, once dark and glossy, became brittle and dull, falling out in clumps from malnutrition and stress. Her teeth, deprived of proper care, began to decay. Her muscles, unused except for the minimal movements required to shift position on the bed, atrophied. But perhaps the worst deterioration was mental. Human beings are not meant for solitary confinement. Our brains require stimulation, social interaction, environmental variety. Deprived of these things, the mind begins to cannibalize itself. Edith had no books to read, no one to talk to, nothing to occupy her thoughts except her own memories and the endless loop of trauma that replayed each time her mother opened that door. She began talking to herself. At first, just occasional comments, observations about the light or the weather. Then full conversations with imagined companions, childhood friends, teachers from school, even Raphael, the young man whose interest had triggered her imprisonment. These dialogues became more complex over time, filling the silence with voices that existed only in her head. She developed rituals to mark time and maintain sanity. Each morning, when light first appeared through the vent, she would stand, when she still had the strength to stand, and count to 100. This was morning. When the light faded, she would count to 100 again. This was evening. She had no idea if her markers corresponded to actual morning and evening, but the ritual provided structure, a fragile framework of meaning in a meaningless void. She picked at the wooden floorboards, using her fingernails to dig into the soft spots where water damage had weakened the wood. Over months, she created small holes, then larger ones, though she had no plan for what they might achieve. The act itself was important, the sense of doing something, changing something, having some tiny effect on her environment. Years passed. 1960, 4 became 1965. President Johnson escalated the war in Vietnam. The Watts riots erupted in Los Angeles. The Beatles played Shea Stadium. Life continued below, around, beyond the attic of the yellow house on Delaware Avenue. Edith's brothers grew up, graduated, moved away. Carl left first, joining the army and shipping out to Vietnam, perhaps seeking his own escape from the house's oppressive atmosphere. The youngest, Thomas, went to college in Ohio. Only the eldest, Wilhelm Jr., remained, taking over their father's room when the old man died of a heart attack in 1971. The father's death changed nothing for Edith. The key remained around Clothilda's neck. The lock remained engaged. The routine of minimal food and maximum neglect continued without interruption. Did Edith know her father had died? Probably not. The sounds of mourning would have filtered up through the floor, crying, the low murmur of funeral arrangements, the arrival of relatives, but without context, these were just more inexplicable noises. In the cacophony of incomprehensible life below, the 1970s arrived, disco, Watergate, the oil crisis. The world transformed yet again, while Edith remained frozen in her timeless prison. Her hair had gone prematurely gray by her mid-30s. Her skin, never exposed to sunlight, was paper, white, stretched tight over bones that seemed too prominent. Her eyes, once her most striking feature, had developed the flat, thousand-yard stare of trauma victims and prisoners of war. She no longer made eye contact on the rare occasions when Clothilda entered the attic. She had learned that looking directly at her mother only invited anger. She spoke less frequently, even to her imagined companions. The conversations had become burdensome, requiring energy she didn't have. Mostly she lay on the bed, drifting between sleep and waking, between present reality and dissociative fugue states where time and place became meaningless. In 1980, Edith turned 30, 8 years old. She had been in the attic for 17 years, nearly half her life. She had entered as a young woman full of undefined potential. She had become something else entirely, something broken and reshaped by captivity into a form that could survive where no person should have to survive. It was a fire that finally broke the silence. In the early morning hours of January 14, 1993, an electrical fire started in the walls of the Eckert house. Old wiring, never updated, finally failed under the demand of too many space heaters running in the bitter Buffalo cold. The fire began in the first floor walls and spread upward, following the natural chimney effect of the house's structure. Clothilda, now 80, 1 year old and sleeping in the first floor bedroom she'd moved to after Wilhelm S.R.'s death, woke to smoke. She managed to get outside and call 911 from a neighbor's house, standing on the frozen lawn in her nightgown, watching flames lick from the second-story windows. The Buffalo Fire Department arrived within minutes. Firefighters deployed hoses, broke windows, entered the structure. They cleared the first floor. They cleared the second floor. They prepared to declare the building empty of occupants. Then someone noticed the attic door. It was closed, unusual in a fire where every door should have been open for ventilation and search. More unusual was the lock, a heavy duty mechanism that had no business being on an interior door. The firefighter, Captain Robert Morrison, called for a tool to break it open. When the door gave way, smoke billowed out from the superheated attic space. Morrison directed his flashlight into the darkness, expecting to see stored boxes, old furniture, the usual detritus of a family home. Instead, he saw a person, a woman, skeletal and gray, crouched in the corner like an animal, her arms raised to shield her face from the sudden intrusion of light and noise. She wore what might once have been a nightgown, now shredded and filthy, barely covering her emaciated frame. Her hair hung in matted clumps. Her skin was covered in sores and excrement. Morrison would later tell investigators that his first thought was that he'd discovered a corpse. Only when the figure moved, a slight flinching motion, did he realize she was alive. "My God," he said into his radio. "We need an ambulance. We've got a victim up here, female, severe condition." The extraction was difficult. Edith couldn't walk. Her legs had atrophied from decades of minimal use. She couldn't speak. Whether from physical damage to her vocal cords or psychological trauma wasn't immediately clear. She flinched violently at any attempt to touch her, making guttural sounds of distress. Eventually, Morrison and another firefighter wrapped her in a blanket and carried her down the stairs and out into the frozen January morning. Emergency medical technicians immediately began treatment, starting Roman force, assessing her vital signs, radioing ahead to Erie County Medical Center that they were bringing in what appeared to be a severe case of prolonged abuse and neglect. On the lawn, Clothilde Eckert stood watching, her expression unreadable. When police officers approached her and asked about the woman found in the attic, she was silent for a long moment. Then, calmly, as if discussing the weather, she said, "That is my daughter, Edith. She has been ill." "How long has she been in the attic, ma'am?" the officer asked. Another pause, then, "Since 1963. The officer later reported that he had to ask her to repeat herself, certain he'd misheard. 30 years, 3 decades. The woman in the ambulance, who appeared to be in her 60s or 70s, was only 51 years old. The investigation that followed was both straightforward and bafflingly complex. The physical evidence was undeniable. Edith Eckert had been imprisoned in her family's attic for approximately 30 years, suffering conditions that medical experts would later testify were among the worst cases of prolonged confinement and neglect they had ever encountered. But the question that haunted investigators was simple: how? How had this gone undetected for 3 decades? How had no one noticed? How had a woman simply disappeared from society without triggering any alarms? The answers revealed uncomfortable truths about the gaps in social systems, about the privacy we afford families even when that privacy enables horror, about the way vulnerable people can slip through every net designed to catch them. The property tax records showed that the Eckert home had been inspected multiple times over the years. But inspectors looked at foundations, electrical systems, plumbing. They didn't search attics for hidden prisoners. The house had been sold once, in 1985, when Clothilde transferred ownership to Wilhelm Jr. The paperwork had been filed. No one questioned why a middle-aged woman's name didn't appear anywhere. Social Security records showed that Edith had never applied for disability benefits, never collected unemployment, never filed tax returns after 1963. She had simply ceased to exist in the eyes of every bureaucratic system, but the systems never reached out to ask why. She wasn't committing fraud. She wasn't drawing on resources. She was causing no problems for anyone except herself, and the self doesn't file complaints. The brothers were interviewed. Carl, the middle son, had returned from Vietnam in 1968 and moved to California. He admitted knowing that Edith was kept upstairs, but claimed he thought it was a temporary psychiatric intervention, that she was dangerous to herself, that his mother was doing what was necessary. He had never gone up to see her, he had never asked questions, he had simply left. Thomas, the youngest, had visited the house occasionally over the years. He too had known, how could he not, that his sister was in the attic, but he had rationalized it the same way. Mother knows best. Edith is ill. This is a family matter. He had brought his own children to visit their grandmother, had sat in the living room drinking coffee and eating cake, while his sister languished in the darkness above. Wilhelm Jr., who had lived in the house the entire time, was the most culpable by proximity, but the least willing to take responsibility. He claimed he'd simply learned not to question his mother, that asking about Edith only provoked rage, that it was easier to pretend the locked attic door was just another feature of the house, like the basement or the garage. None of the brothers were charged. The district attorney's office determined that while their moral failure was absolute, their legal culpability was harder to establish. They hadn't physically imprisoned Edith. They hadn't held the key. They had simply looked away, and looking away, it turned out, was not technically a crime. Clothilde was arrested and charged with unlawful imprisonment, reckless endangerment, and assault. She showed no remorse. In interviews with police and psychiatric evaluators, she maintained that she had done what was necessary to protect Edith from her own bad decisions, that the outside world was dangerous, that keeping her daughter in the attic was an act of love, twisted though it was. Psychiatric evaluation found her competent to stand trial, but noted severe personality disorders, narcissistic traits, delusional thinking, and inability to empathize. The evaluator's report suggested that Clothilde genuinely believed she had done the right thing, that in her own internally consistent moral universe, imprisoning her daughter for 30 years was a form of maternal duty. The trial of Clothilde Eckert began on November 8, 1993, in Erie County Supreme Court. It lasted 3 weeks and attracted national media attention, becoming one of those rare cases that transcends local news to become a cultural touchstone, a symbol of questions larger than the facts themselves. The prosecution's case was overwhelming. Medical experts testified about the condition. Edith was found in severe malnutrition, pressure sores that had developed into deep wounds, dental decay so advanced that most of her teeth had to be extracted, muscle atrophy so severe that physical therapy experts estimated she would never walk normally again. Psychologists testified about the profound psychological damage of prolonged isolation, comparing Edith's condition to that of prisoners of war subjected to extended solitary confinement. Fire Captain Morrison testified about finding her in the attic, his voice breaking as he described the moment he realized the huddled figure in the corner was a living human being. "She looked at me," he said, "and I saw in her eyes that she didn't know if I was there to help or to hurt her more. That look. I'll never forget it as long as I live." The defense strategy was to argue that Clothilde had acted out of mental illness herself, that her understanding of reality was so distorted that she couldn't appreciate the wrongness of her actions. They brought their own psychiatric experts who testified about delusional disorders, about cultural factors that might have contributed to her extreme need for control, about the way immigrant parents from authoritarian backgrounds sometimes struggle to adapt to American notions of individual autonomy. But the most powerful testimony came from Edith herself. She had been in treatment for 9 months by the time of the trial, receiving intensive medical care, psychiatric support, and physical therapy. She still couldn't walk unassisted. Her voice was raspy, permanently damaged from years of disuse, but she could speak, and she insisted on speaking. Wheeled into the courtroom in a wheelchair, Edith looked far older than her 51 years. But her eyes, those dark eyes that had once been her most striking feature, held a clarity that was heartbreaking. She was present, she was here, she had survived. The prosecutor asked her gently, "Can you tell the court what happened to you?" Edith's hands trembled in her lap. She looked down, then up at the ceiling, then finally at the jury. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper, but the courtroom had gone so silent that every word was audible. "My mother," she said, "locked me in the attic when I was 21 years old. She said I had to be punished for wanting to make my own choices. She said the outside world was evil and she was protecting me. At first I screamed, I begged, I promised I would be good, but she never let me out. Days became weeks, weeks became years. I forgot what year it was. I forgot what I looked like. I forgot who I was. I became nothing but the attic, the heat, the cold, the darkness, the hunger, the fear. That was my life. For 30 years, that was my entire life." She paused, tears streaming down her sunken cheeks. "When the fireman opened the door and I saw the light, I thought I was dying. I thought it was death coming for me, and I was grateful. I was so grateful because I thought death meant the suffering would finally end, but it wasn't death. It was rescue. It was life trying to give me a second chance. And now I'm here, and I'm real again, and I want everyone to know that what she did to me." She looked directly at her mother for the first time. It was not love, it was not protection, it was cruelty, pure cruelty, and no one should ever be allowed to do that to another person, no matter what reasons they give. Clothilde, sitting at the defense table, showed no reaction. Her face remained as impassive as it had been throughout the trial, a mask of stone. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours, guilty on all counts. On December 7, 1993, Judge Raymond M. Volker sentenced Clothilde Eckert to 15 years to life in prison. In his statement before imposing sentence, he spoke at length about the nature of her crime. "What you did to your daughter," Judge Volker said, "represents a betrayal so fundamental that it challenges our understanding of human relationships. A parent's duty is to nurture, to protect, to prepare their child for independence. You did the opposite. You imprisoned her. You stole 3 decades of her life, decades she can never recover. You reduced a human being to the status of a hidden thing, a shameful secret, to be locked away and forgotten. The law provides for imprisonment as punishment for crimes. You created your own prison for someone who committed no crime beyond wanting to exercise her basic human right to choose her own path. The sentence I impose today is insufficient to match the magnitude of your offense, but it is the maximum the law allows. Clothilde was 81 years old. 15 years to life was effectively a death sentence. She showed no emotion as bailiffs led her away. She would die in prison 11 years later, in 2004, without ever expressing remorse or acknowledging the full horror of what she had done. For Edith, the aftermath was both liberation and ongoing struggle. She remained in residential care facilities, receiving continued treatment for the physical and psychological wounds that would never fully heal. She learned to walk again, after a fashion, a slow, shuffling gait that required a walker. She gained weight, though her body never fully recovered from the years of malnutrition. Her teeth were replaced with dentures. Her hair was cut and styled, but the deeper damage was permanent. She never fully readjusted to the world outside. Technology confused her computers, cell phones, even automatic doors at stores. She had missed the entire digital revolution, had gone into the attic in an era of rotary phones and black and white television, and emerged into a world of the internet and satellite communication. Social interactions overwhelmed her. She couldn't make small talk, couldn't navigate the unspoken rules of casual conversation that most people absorb without thinking. Most heartbreakingly, she had lost the possibility of a normal life trajectory. At 51, she was past the age of starting a family, building a career, accumulating the experiences that constitute a full human existence. Those possibilities had been stolen from her, and no court verdict could return them, but she tried. In interviews with social workers and the few journalists she agreed to speak with, Edith expressed a simple desire to be normal, to go to a grocery store and pick out her own food, to sit in a park and watch children play, to have a conversation with another person about the weather or a television show. These tiny fragments of ordinary existence, which most people barely notice or take entirely for granted, were her definition of freedom. The case prompted some policy changes. New York State strengthened its adult protective services, creating better systems for checking on vulnerable adults who might be at risk of abuse or neglect. The Edith Eckert case became a reference point in training for social workers, emergency responders, and healthcare providers. A reminder that horror can hide in plain sight, that the absence of complaints doesn't mean the absence of victims, but ultimately, the lesson was simpler and more unsettling. We live surrounded by walls and doors, and we rarely ask what might be behind them. The story of Edith Eckert remains a disturbing reminder that the cruelest prisons are sometimes built by those who claim to love us, that the most profound violations of human dignity can occur not in distant places, but in the houses next door, behind windows with curtains drawn, and doors with locks facing the wrong way. Her case forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about family privacy, and when it crosses the line into enabling abuse, about the assumptions we make when someone simply disappears from view, about the collective responsibility we bear for the vulnerable people in our communities, and the ways we rationalize looking away when acknowledging suffering would require us to act. Edith's brothers knew. The neighbors must have suspected something, even if they didn't know the full truth. The systems designed to track and account for citizens failed to notice when one simply vanished from all records. Everyone who might have helped chose not to see, not to ask, not to intrude on family matters, and Edith paid the price. But questions remain, haunting in their persistence. Was Edith truly the only victim? Or were there others like her, in attics and basements and locked rooms across the country, invisible to everyone except their captors? When Edith's case was publicized, did other families see it and feel a moment of recognition, a terrible knowledge that they too were hiding someone? The statistics on missing adults suggest that many people vanish each year without triggering significant searches. Some are runaways fleeing abusive situations. Some are victims of violence. But some, perhaps, are like Edith, erased by the people who should protect them, imprisoned in plain sight, waiting for a rescue that may never come. To this day, the yellow house on Delaware Avenue stands though it has been sold and renovated, transformed into something new. The attic was finished, turned into a proper bedroom with insulation and carpet and fresh paint. You would never know, looking at it from the street, what horror it once contained. And on winter nights, when snow falls softly on Buffalo and the street lights create pools of yellow glow on the frozen pavement, people walking past sometimes report a strange sensation, a feeling of being watched from that circular attic window, though the house is dark and no one is there. Just imagination, probably. The projection of the mind that knows the history of a place. Or perhaps it's something else. Perhaps it's the ghost of all those lost years, the accumulated weight of suffering that can never quite be erased, that lingers in the walls and the floorboards and the very air of a place where such cruelty occurred. If this journey through one of the most disturbing cases of familial imprisonment in modern American history has resonated with you, If you find yourself pondering the invisible suffering that might exist behind locked doors in ordinary seeming houses, then consider subscribing to the Untold Hour. There are many more stories waiting to be told, mysteries buried in time that deserve to be examined, voices that were silenced and need to be heard again. Leave a like if this account provoked reflections that go beyond mere entertainment, if it made you think about the responsibility we all bear for the vulnerable members of our communities, if it reminded you that evil sometimes wears the face of family and protection, can become the cruelest form of imprisonment. Comment and share your perspectives. Have you ever wondered about a neighbor who suddenly disappeared from view? Have you ever had that instinct that something was wrong in a nearby house, but talked yourself out of asking questions? This story should haunt us not because it's unique, but because it represents a horror that might be more common than we want to believe. Edith Eckert died in 2011 at the age of 69. She had spent 18 years of freedom after 30 years of imprisonment, a ratio that seems cosmically unjust. But those 18 years, by all accounts, brought her moments of genuine joy. She loved sitting in the sun. She loved the rain on her face. She loved the simple act of choosing what to eat for dinner. In the end, perhaps that's what her story teaches us. That freedom, true freedom, is found in the smallest things we take for granted. And that the greatest crime is not violence in the traditional sense, but the theft of a person's agency, their choices, their ability to exist as themselves in the world. Her voice, silenced for so long, spoke one truth that deserves to be remembered. No one has the right to erase another person's existence, no matter what justifications they offer, no matter how much they claim it's for that person's own good. Until next time, remember that the most important stories are often the ones hidden in darkness, waiting for someone to shine a light and bear witness. This is the Untold Hour.